I do recall one time in my presentation to the Parliament, I argued that the then Parliamentary Committee in Finance, that we need to create buffers in the economy so that when there are surprise side shocks, we can actually at least mitigate in the short term. And those buffers, for example, related to food security. Of course, it's expensive to store cereals for a long time, but the best thing is actually to have resources to do that, to buy at that particular time. Energy resources, that is petroleum backups. And then, of course, we should have buffers in terms of fiscal space. And finally, we should have buffers from the central bank in terms of foreign exchange reserves. Those are four main buffers that can help us navigate in the short term. But unfortunately, when the shock hits us, for example, right now, if you look at that, it's only perhaps the central bank which has foreign exchange reserves. And you can see that essentially it's going to be problematic. But then, what we really need is actually fiscal intervention to create some space and even to save lives. But again, it comes in at a time when we don't have that fiscal space. Especially, you mentioned the debt. We are in agreement with that. I think right now, the way the situation is, given the multiple shocks, and even the surprise side shocks that are quite prevalent, the best would be to look for concessional financing that would retire most of the debt, especially the domestic debt, which is very, very expensive. It's taking quite a large proportion of recurrent expenditure, about to the tune of about 33%. So that will be the starting point. And then after that, we'll have some time, that is in the very short term. Then over time, the fiscal space can be rebuilt, including reforms that may come up actually to improve the revenue side. Because right now, the biggest problem is the revenue side. So essentially, one of the lessons that we should pick up from here is actually how to deal with supply side shocks. It was always a problem even during my time. Because one of the things about the supply side shock and monetary policy phenomena is that you have to actually tighten monetary policy to ride over the shocks. But essentially what you do is actually to push the economy into a temporary recession, hoping that once the supply shocks are resolved, we do not have that plateau of high prices. We will destroy that. But if there is pain, by the time you do that, and even when the supply side issues are resolved, this is the pain we have to undergo, we have to wait for. But I do believe that the most important steps is always to make sure that we have fiscal space that can now allow us some flexibility to ride over the shocks. And that is going to be created by, first of all, resolving or reprofiling the debt that we have, having some concessional funding that is going to retire some of the most expensive domestic debt. And then consolidation. The president has already signaled some signals about fiscal consolidation. And this is something that will continue, but it will not continue until we resolve the crisis facing us, and then we resolve the debt issues. That's how I would approach it. It should be a short-term problem that can be solved, but it has to take a bit of time. Thank you, Majority Leader. Thank you for your fantastic questions. During my time, there is no bank that collapsed. I was governor of the Central Bank of Kenya from March 2007 to the beginning of March in 2015. That does not mean, Mheshimiwa Majority Leader Bwana Kimani Ichung'wah, that there were no problems. There were problems. But you have to make sure that you bring in or you develop new solutions and new interventions to save the market. And that's what we did. There were several mergers, but those mergers were actually geared towards preventing any collapse of the banks, because market situations do change. Some projections in marketplace can change. And so the regulator must know what to do. A regulator is not someone who is waving an axe in the market. A regulator is a person who is trying to understand the market, help